They say a house remembers. The walls absorb secrets, the halls echo with sins, and the very foundation is steeped in the rot of those who once called it home. At Bellrose Manor, history is not preserved. It festers, waiting for anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. The story begins not with thunder, nor with fire, but with silence. A silence that hung too heavily, like the air before a storm, thick with things unsaid. Bellrose Manor had stood on the edge of the county for nearly 2 centuries, abandoned for decades, its windows blind with dust and its roof sagging like the spine of some exhausted beast. Yet even in its decay, it commanded presence. Travelers on the old road swore they felt its gaze upon them, as if the house itself weighed and measured every soul that passed. For years the manor was avoided, except by the desperate children daring one another to touch its gate, vagrants who found its cellars more hospitable than the cold of the woods, and men of ambition who swore they could tame its land and resurrect its legacy. None stayed long. Some claimed they heard voices whispering in the rafters, others spoke of doors that closed by themselves, of footsteps that trailed them through the corridors, though no figure followed. A few never spoke again at all. But time has a cruel way of drawing people back to ruins. What we inherit, we cannot always escape. It was in the spring of 1911 that Margaret Bellrose returned to the house of her ancestors. She had been gone nearly 20 years, having fled with her mother after the fire that claimed her father and elder brother. The manor, left to rot in her absence, had now fallen into her reluctant care. She came not with excitement, but with duty, for debts bound her, and the will of her late uncle decreed she must occupy the manor for 1 year before she could claim the modest inheritance left to her. Margaret was a woman of stern composure, tempered by grief and necessity. Her life in the city had been modest, her occupation as a governess respectable, if unremarkable. But she carried herself with an austerity that made others keep their distance, as though sorrow had carved sharpness into her face. Returning to Bellrose Manor, she thought, would be nothing more than a formality. A year of solitude in a crumbling house, a ritual of endurance before she could sell what remained and leave it behind forever. Yet when she first stepped onto the path leading to the front door, her resolve trembled. The air was colder here, though the sun still hung above the hills. The weeds in the garden bent not with the wind, but as though something unseen brushed against them. The house loomed before her, its windows black, its stones darkened by moss and rain. A raven perched upon the crooked chimney, watching unblinking, as though it were a sentinel of whatever lingered inside. The caretaker, Mr. Alden, was waiting at the door. He was a man of few words, his back bent by labor and his eyes wary. He offered her the keys without ceremony, muttering only, "The house doesn't take kindly to strangers." "I am no stranger," Margaret replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "This was once my home." Alden's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, as if weighing her claim before he turned and left down the path without another word. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mold and soot. The grand hall stretched upward into darkness, the chandelier above long fallen, its shards scattered like bones across the marble floor. Dust lay upon every surface, soft as ash, disturbed only by the prints of small creatures that had claimed the house in her absence. But beneath it all, there was something else, a presence, intangible yet undeniable, like the hush of a chapel where one is not alone. Margaret lit a lamp and walked the corridors slowly, her footsteps echoing too loudly, as though the house resented the intrusion. She passed portraits of her ancestors, their painted eyes dull with dust but still sharp with judgment. Her father's likeness loomed above the staircase, his stern features carved in oil and shadow. She could not look at him long. That first night, she made her bed in the study, refusing to climb to the bedrooms above. The fire she built crackled weakly, as though reluctant to warm her. She tried to sleep, but the silence was never complete. The house groaned as if shifting its weight, floorboards creaked in rooms she had not entered, and once, just once, she thought she heard a child's laughter, faint as a sigh, drifting from the upper halls. She told herself it was only memory, that grief was playing its cruel games as it always had. Yet when she closed her eyes, she dreamt of fire again, of the night her father and brother had perished. She remembered her mother's hand clutching hers as smoke filled the corridors, the heat searing her lungs, the screams behind them cut short. She awoke with her own cry still in her throat, the room cold though the fire had not yet died. At dawn, Margaret stood before the window, staring at the overgrown garden. The mist clung to the earth like a shroud, and the raven was still there, unblinking. She wondered if the house waited for her to remember, if it had been waiting all along. For in places such as Bellrose Manor, memory is not passive, it is active, alive, and hungry. The house does not forgive, it does not forget. It waits endlessly for those bound to it by blood and by sin, until the living surrender to the weight of the dead. And so, dear listener, if a house remembers, if its walls breathe with the sins of the past, then when you return to it, are you walking into your own memories, or theirs? They say some houses are not merely built, but born of ambition, of pride, of sins so deeply rooted that the earth itself groans beneath them. Bellrose Manor was such a house. Its stones were quarried from the moors, its timbers drawn from ancient forests, and its halls once rang with the voices of wealth, refinement, and lineage. But in 1893, all that remained was ruin, and ruin does not forget. Jonathan Hale had devoted his life to the past. A historian, a chronicler of estates and their ghosts, he considered himself a man of reason. Yet even reason can tremble before the persistence of a dream. For months he had dreamt of a woman, pale, still, framed in a high window of a crumbling house. She did not speak, did not move, but her silence called to him, beckoning. When the commission came to document Bellrose Manor before its demolition, he did not hesitate. It felt less like chance than fate. The journey to Yorkshire was long and bitter. The moors spread like a desolate sea beneath a grey sky. The carriage wheels churned through mud. The wind carried with it the scent of peat and rain. And all the while Jonathan felt a pressure growing in his chest, a weight that was not fear but inevitability. He was not approaching Bellrose. Bellrose was drawing him in. When at last the manor appeared upon the horizon, it was less a house than a silhouette. Its towers jutted like broken teeth, its walls darkened by lichen and neglect. The windows gaped black, as though the eyes of the house had long since rotted away. Even from a distance, it seemed to lean forward, watching the road. The driver crossed himself, muttered a prayer, and urged the horses faster. The village at the edge of the moors was small, huddled, its people wary. They greeted Jonathan with silence, then whispers. When he introduced himself, their expressions shifted from suspicion to pity. Bellrose Manor was not a place one visited willingly. "You'll not sleep easy there," said the innkeeper, her hands trembling as she poured him ale. The Bellroses were a proud line, but pride is the seed of madness. The father lost to drink, the mother to despair. The children, she stopped, glanced over her shoulder. They say some vanished. Others left behind stains that never washed clean. Another villager added, "The house keeps what it sets owed. Those who linger too long don't set come back as they were, if they come back at all." Jonathan listened, scribbling notes, but their words stirred something more than curiosity. It was recognition, as though his dreams had already whispered the same warnings. Still, he told himself that ghosts were but stories, and stories were what he had come to collect. The next morning he stood before the manor gates. Rust had devoured their iron, ivy clung to their frame, yet they yielded easily to his touch, as if welcoming him. The path wound through wild gardens where roses had grown into thorns and statues crumbled into faceless effigies. At the door he paused. The air here was different, still, heavy, dense with memory. He turned the key, and Bellrose opened to him. Inside, the grandeur was not gone, but decayed. The great hall stretched upward into shadow, its once sparkling chandelier now a mass of rusted chains and shattered glass. Tattered curtains swayed, though the air was still. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes dulled by dust yet sharp with accusation. He felt their gaze follow him as he crossed the floor. Everywhere, the house seemed to breathe. Floorboards whispered under his step. Doors sighed when he passed. The silence was not empty. It was crowded, thick with the weight of voices unheard but not forgotten. Jonathan felt it at his back, in the corners of his vision. The manor resented intrusion, and he knew it. He set about his work with diligence, measuring rooms, sketching staircases, cataloguing details of architecture. But though his pen scratched steadily upon the page, his mind was restless. In the library, where the scent of damp paper and mildew stung his nostrils, he thought he saw a figure pass between shelves, the faint shape of a woman in white. When he turned, the aisle was empty. As dusk fell, shadows grew long and distorted. Jonathan built a fire in the hearth, its crackle too small to warm the vast chamber. He ate sparingly, then returned to his notes, but weariness claimed him. He made his bed upon the library's rug, the shelves towering above like watchful sentinels. The house seemed to sigh as he closed his eyes. It was near midnight when he woke to the sound of music. Faint, delicate, almost tender. A lullaby, drifting from the upper floors. The notes were soft, as though carried upon breath rather than instrument, yet unmistakable. He rose, lamp in hand, his heart pounding not with fear, but with recognition. He had heard it before, in his dreams. He ascended the staircase, each step groaning beneath him. The song grew clearer, yet the halls were empty. He followed it down a corridor where the wallpaper had peeled like shedding skin, and the portraits there had no faces, their canvases slashed. At the end of the hall stood a door. The lullaby seemed to hum from behind it, low and steady, as if sung for a child long dead. But when he reached for the handle, the song ceased. The silence was worse than the sound. He opened the door to find only dust, shadows, and an empty cradle in the corner. Jonathan did not sleep again that night. He sat in the library, fire reduced to embers, listening to the house shift and murmur around him. He knew then that he was not merely a guest within Bellrose. He was a witness summoned. His commission was not to preserve a ruin, but to exhume its story, a story the house itself demanded to be told. The line between duty and destiny had already blurred. He was no longer certain he could leave, even if he wished. And so, dear listener, if a house remembers, if it keeps its dead within its walls, then I must ask you, when the living step across its threshold, do they enter a house of stone and timber, or a tomb that is already writing their place within it? Bellrose Manor was not merely built, it was declared a proclamation of power etched into the landscape. Jonathan discovered its beginnings not from the villagers' rumors, but from the brittle remains of ink and paper hidden within the manor itself. Behind a locked cabinet in the library, beneath moth-eaten drapes and dust thick as ash, he unearthed a stack of diaries bound in leather and brittle with age. Alongside them lay portraits, their frames cracked, their canvases darkened by mildew. These artifacts, long forgotten, spoke with a voice clearer than stone, the voice of Lord Percival Bellrose, the man who raised the house from the moors in 1792. In those journals Jonathan read ambition laid bare. Percival wrote not merely as a man of wealth, but as one who believed himself ordained. His words circled endlessly upon blood. The purity of it, the continuity of it, the destiny it bestowed. The manor, he insisted, would stand as his monument, not to God, nor to king, but to his own lineage. This house shall be the root from which my name shall never die. Even the earth itself shall bear the weight of Bellrose blood, and from it, dominion. Jonathan paused often as he read, struck by the arrogance, the certainty that wealth and lineage were not blessings but weapons. He imagined Percival standing before the foundations of the house, his gaze unyielding, his hand steady as the first stones were laid. To the world he was a benefactor, an employer, a lord. But between the lines cruelty dripped like venom. Letters written by Eleanor, Percival's wife, revealed another story, the silent half. Jonathan found them tucked between pages of an old ledger, as though someone had hidden them deliberately. Eleanor's hand was delicate, her voice weary. She wrote of solitude, of being locked within a gilded cage. She described days when the manor seemed to press in upon her, its walls closing like fists. Her words grew darker with each page until they ended abruptly. The official records marked her death as sudden illness in 1796, but Eleanor Sitt's last surviving letter hinted otherwise. I have raised my voice, and now I fear it shall be silenced forever. Should these words be found, know that I did not go willingly to my grave. Jonathan felt a chill as he traced her fading ink. The villagers had whispered of Eleanor for generations, speaking not of sickness but of defiance and of burial, quiet and hurried, as though the earth itself had been made complicit in her silencing. The further Jonathan read, the more he sensed the foundations of Bellrose were not stone but sacrifice. Old accounts spoke of workers who vanished during construction, laborers who came for coin and shelter, yet never left the moors again, their names erased from record, their families paid in silence. Some said the mortar was mixed not only with lime but with blood, sealing a covenant beneath every brick. By candlelight, Jonathan turned each fragile page, the ink bleeding into his mind like poison. The house seemed to react as he uncovered its beginnings. Scratches whispered within the walls, faint at first, like the scurry of rats. Yet the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate, as though something clawed from within, something long trapped. He paused, lamp raised, his breath held, but the sound ceased the moment he acknowledged it. On the far wall of the library, the portrait of Percival hung crooked. The face was sharp, angular, eyes painted with an intensity that seemed to pierce even centuries later. Jonathan had passed it a dozen times before without pause, but that night it unsettled him. The candlelight flickered, and for an instant he thought the painted eyes shifted, not merely following him, but narrowing, as though disapproving of his intrusion. He told himself it was a trick of wax and flame, yet he could not look away. Those eyes, cold and grey, carried the weight of judgment, not upon the house, but upon him. The fire dwindled in the hearth, the chill of the moors seeping into his bones. Jonathan continued his reading, though each line seemed heavier than the last. Percival's journals grew erratic in later entries, veering from pride to obsession. He wrote of visions, of hearing voices in the night calling his name, of dreams where the stones of the house bled. Still, he never questioned his path. To him, sacrifice was not cruelty, but necessity. A legacy is not gifted. It is bought, and I have paid the price gladly. Jonathan closed the book with trembling hands. His training as a historian urged him to treat these accounts as artifacts, records of a man's descent into obsession. Yet a deeper voice within him whispered that these were not relics at all, but living roots. That in opening the diaries, he had not exhumed history, he had disturbed something that still stirred beneath the floors. The scratches in the walls began again, louder this time, closer. He pressed his ear against the paneling, heart hammering. Behind the wood, faint and deliberate, something scraped. Not the random scurry of vermin, but the dragging of nails. He stepped back, breath uneven, gaze drawn once more to Percival Sepp's portrait. The eyes glinted under the candlelight, cruel, accusing. Jonathan whispered into the silence, "What did you bury here?" The house did not answer. It did not need to. Its weight pressed down upon him, thick with unspoken confession. That night, sleep did not come. Jonathan lay awake beneath the portrait, listening to the whispers of the manor. Each groan of timber, each settling of stone, seemed less like decay and more like remembrance, as though the house itself was rehearsing its sins, waiting for him to write them into permanence. And so he understood. He was no longer documenting Bellrose. He was being taught by it, shaped by it, judged by it. The historian had come to unearth the past, but the past was already awake. The sins of a house are rarely its foundations alone. They echo most clearly through those raised within its walls. Jonathan's exploration of Bellrose Manor led him from Percival's diaries into the brittle records of his children, fragments of letters, reports from tutors, and faded birth registries stored in a chest beneath the staircase. In those papers, the Bellrose legacy revealed its cruel symmetry. There were 2 sons. Charles the elder carried his father's stern jaw and sharper ambition. Tutors described him as disciplined, intelligent, fluent in languages, and quick to wield authority over servants and siblings alike. But beneath their praise lingered unease. Charles's brilliance was tempered by cruelty. He delighted in small acts of dominance, breaking toys to assert ownership, striking animals to demonstrate power, forcing the younger William into submission under the guise of games. One tutor's words trembled on the page. The boy does not play, he tests. He studies suffering as though it were a lesson. William, by contrast, was quiet, pale, and often ill. His records carried less admiration and more dismissal. Tutors called him distracted, prone to staring at corners of the room as though listening to voices unheard by others. He wrote of dreams, always the same dream, of a corridor bathed in red, stretching endlessly, though no plan of the manor contained such a hall. In his letters, William begged his mother for comfort, speaking of walls that seemed to bleed, of whispers that spoke his name at night. Eleanor's replies, soft, sorrowful, ceased abruptly after her death. Afterward, William's writings grew frantic, desperate. The pattern was unmistakable. One child celebrated, the other consumed. Jonathan noted how the tutor's correspondence mirrored the documents from earlier generations of the Bellrose line. Each record seemed to carry the same refrain, one heir rising, the other falling into silence, madness, or sudden death. It was as though the house demanded division, harmony disrupted, balance broken, one life devoured so the other could thrive. Jonathan wrote these notes with shaking hands. The weight of them pressed upon him like stone. This was not the cruelty of chance, nor merely the legacy of flawed men. It was ritual, repeated across generations. The house was not merely shelter, it was appetite. That night, when the lamps were low and the fire in the library sputtered into embers, Jonathan heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, as though a child walked the upper floors. He rose, lamp in hand, and followed them up the grand staircase. Each step echoed too long in the silence, until he could no longer tell if the sound belonged to him or to something unseen. The corridor above was colder, narrower, its wallpaper torn, the air damp with mildew. The footsteps led him further, deeper, until he reached a hallway he did not recall from his earlier surveys. It stretched long and unbroken, its walls stained dark, pulsing faintly as though with a heartbeat of their own. Jonathan stopped, breath caught in his throat. The light from his lamp flickered, shadows crawling like living things. He turned to retreat, but the corridor behind him was gone. Where he expected the grand landing, there was only more hallway, stretching endlessly into shadow. The air pressed in on him, thick, suffocating, and he knew without doubt that he had stepped into William's torment. Here in this corridor of shifting walls and unseen whispers, Jonathan felt the boy's despair. He could almost hear William's voice, pleading, frantic, insisting the house was alive, that it swallowed him whole while no one listened. Jonathan's chest tightened with panic, his historian's mind fraying against the certainty that he too was being consumed. The walls seemed to breathe, the stains upon them darkening, running downward like fresh blood. He pressed his hand against one panel. It was damp, warm, as though flesh pulsed beneath the wood. He staggered back, nearly dropping his lamp, heart pounding with the knowledge that he was no longer documenting history. He was walking within it. The lullaby from the first night stirred faintly at the edges of hearing, but twisted, mournful, a dirge rather than comfort. It drew him forward, and against every instinct, he followed. The corridor narrowed, pressing him, forcing him onward until he could hardly breathe. At last he reached a door at the end, warped, splintering, as though something within had clawed to be free. His hand hovered above the handle. Then the footsteps ceased. The air stilled, and in that silence, Jonathan felt eyes upon him, not from a figure, not from any portrait, but from the house itself. Watching, waiting, measuring whether he would open the door, whether he would step fully into the role it had carved for him. He wrenched himself away, stumbling backward. His lamp sputtered, nearly extinguished. He turned, and this time the corridor behind him had returned, the grand landing visible once more, the library's faint glow below. He hurried down the stairs, chest heaving, throat dry, as though he had escaped drowning. Back in the library, he slammed Percival's journals shut and pressed his hands to his face. The house had shown him something, not merely memory, but its hunger. It demanded imbalance, demanded sacrifice, and in its red corridors the devoured cried out endlessly, their voices lost beneath centuries of denial. Jonathan whispered into the empty room, though no one was there to hear, "William, I believe you." And in that moment, though the fire was nearly dead, a sudden warmth stirred in the library, fleeting, fragile, like the ghost of gratitude. But the house was not finished. It never was. History often buries its darkest sins beneath the polished stone of ceremony, and Bellrose Manor was no exception. In the mid-1800s, the house became the stage for a union that promised to restore its grandeur, the marriage of Charles Bellrose to young Lillian Fairmont, a woman known for her grace and lineage rather than for any wealth of her own. The match was celebrated among the aristocracy, a union of power and tradition, of dominance sealed with vows. Yet the legacy of Bellrose had no room for love. The wedding, Jonathan learns, was opulent beyond reason. He uncovers descriptions in society papers, yellowed clippings preserved in bound volumes, white roses lining the chapel pews, chandeliers ablaze with hundreds of candles, and guests dressed in silks and lace. The accounts praised Charles as the heir of a legacy unbroken, and Lillian as the jewel who now adorns the house. But even within the honeyed words, Jonathan detects unease. One note, scribbled in the margin of a guest list, simply reads, "She trembled at the altar." It was on that very night, when laughter still echoed in the dining hall and champagne still bubbled in gilded glasses, that Lillian vanished. Charles insisted she had fled, humiliated him, abandoned her vows, proved herself unworthy of Bellrose blood. To the public, he played the role of the scorned groom, his honor intact. Yet whispers spread like contagion among the servants. They spoke of muffled screams from beneath the chapel, of stains on the flagstones that no scrubbing could erase, of footsteps in corridors long after the guests had gone. Jonathan finds nothing of Lillian in the official archives beyond her marriage record. It is as if her life was erased in a single evening. But while searching through a cracked trunk in one of the upper chambers, he uncovers a hidden lining. Pressed between rotting fabric and the wood lies a small journal, its cover soft with age, its pages brittle yet intact. The journal is Lillian Serb's. Her handwriting begins steady, graceful, letters shaped with a practiced hand. She writes of her arrival at Bellrose, her awe at its magnitude, and the subtle unease that shadowed her steps. The house breathes differently at night, she notes. Doors close though no wind stirs. The lamps flicker even when the oil is full. There is a woman's voice. I cannot tell if it is in the hall or in my head, whispering always the same thing. Leave. Day by day, her entries grow more urgent. She writes of Charles's coldness, his disdain for her questions, his obsession with continuing the Bellrose line. She writes of wandering the halls and discovering a narrow door hidden behind a tapestry, a stairwell descending into darkness. It leads beneath the house, she writes. I do not know how deep. I hear water dripping. I hear chains. The final entry is nearly illegible, the ink smeared as though written in haste. The words claw across the page. He has found the stairwell. He will not let me leave. God forgive me. The line breaks abruptly, the page torn at the corner as if ripped by trembling hands. Jonathan sets the journal down, his fingers lingering on the frail paper. The silence of the room presses on him. He realizes now that Lillian did not flee in shame, as Charles proclaimed. She had been silenced, swallowed by the house, or by the cruelty of the husband who mirrored his father's hunger for dominion. That night, Jonathan dreams. He walks the corridors of Bellrose, yet they are not as he knows them. The walls are draped in decayed silk, the air heavy with the scent of wilted roses. Down the staircase, through a hall lined with extinguished candles, he sees her, a woman in a torn bridal gown. Her face is pale, waxen, her eyes hollow yet glistening with desperate sorrow. Across her mouth, crimson threads bind her lips shut, sewn into her flesh with cruel precision. She does not lunge, she does not wail. Instead, she raises one hand toward him, the lace of her sleeve stained and ragged. Her gesture is not of menace, but of plea. Jonathan wakes with his heart pounding, the echo of her silent reaching still vivid in his mind. He understands then that Lillian's presence has not left Bellrose. She lingers, not as a spectre of wrath, but as a memory crying to be remembered, to be spoken of after decades of enforced silence. The house does not simply keep its secrets, it binds them. And Jonathan, by reading her words and walking her dreams, has broken that binding. The air of the manor feels heavier now. Every floorboard creak, every shift of shadow, every sigh of the wind carries with it the weight of a truth too long buried. Lillian is not gone. She waits, still, in the marrow of Bellrose. No dynasty built on cruelty escapes its own design. What begins in triumph often ends in rot, and the Bellrose bloodline was no exception. Through brittle records, Jonathan traces the slow erosion of the family's fortune and name. Where once there had been opulent banquets and noble gatherings, later entries in parish ledgers tell only of unpaid debts, legal disputes, and dwindling harvests from the land surrounding the estate. The manor that had once promised permanence now stood as a mausoleum of withering pride. Charles Bellrose, so proud in his cruelty, left no legacy that flourished. His descendants inherited his estate, but not his fortune. One son succumbed to fever before his 30th year, another took to drink and disappeared in the marshlands. Daughters bore children with frailties that no physician could explain, limbs twisted, eyes clouded, hearts that faltered before they had learned to walk. It was as though the curse of the house seeped into the very wombs of the women who bore its heirs. Yet despite poverty and grief, despite every rational reason to abandon Bellrose, not one heir willingly left. Even those who married into other families returned within years, as though bound by chains unseen. The estate did not merely shelter them, it called them back, demanding their return to the stone cradle that devoured each generation in turn. Jonathan reads letters exchanged between distant cousins of the Bellrose line. One, written in a shaking hand, describes hearing the cries of infants long buried echoing through the corridors. Another speaks of visions of a woman in white descending the stairwell beneath the chapel. "We are never free," the cousin writes. "It is not our name that binds us, but the marrow of the house itself. It carries us as veins carry blood." Among Jonathan's findings are testimonies from clergymen who dared confront the estate, Some were called by desperate heirs, hoping to cleanse what medicine could not cure. Their words are stark, etched with terror. One priest writes, "We prayed, we blessed, we anointed, yet the house stood unmoved, unyielding, as though each stone bore witness and mocked our right. It is not haunted, it is confession made flesh. The walls speak of sin, but refuse absolution." Others did not live to write. Jonathan discovers reports of priests who collapsed suddenly within its halls, their bodies convulsed in fits, their eyes glazed with fear that did not fade in death. One was said to have clawed at his own tongue, as though silenced by something unseen. Another wandered into the woods, and was found days later, barefoot and raving, muttering the same phrase again and again, "It does not forgive." As Jonathan reads, the air in the library thickens. He becomes acutely aware of his reflection in the glass panes of the cabinets. At first it is his face he sees, gaunt from sleepless nights, hollow-eyed from endless research. But then subtle distortions creep in. His cheeks appear sunken, his lips pale, his eyes blackened as though shadow poured into their depths. He blinks, and the image clears, only to warp again when he looks once more. The house, he senses, is measuring him. It presses against his mind like a hand upon glass, testing the boundaries of his will. At night, the pressure deepens. Jonathan wakes to find his reflection not in the mirror alone, but in windows, in polished wood, even in the sheen of spilled water on the floorboards. Each time, the face gazing back seems less his own. The longer he lingers, the more it resembles the portraits of the Bellrose heirs, aristocratic, stern, and cursed with the same hollow stare that Lillian had once described. The question grows in his thoughts, unbidden yet insistent: is he too part of this inheritance? The decline of the Bellrose family was not accident, nor chance, nor merely the consequence of arrogance. It was inheritance in its purest, darkest form, the passing of a hunger older than flesh, a covenant sealed when Percival laid the first stone in blood. The house does not release its children. It consumes them, body and soul, until even their shadows bow to its will. Jonathan closes the final letter, his hands trembling. The ink on the page seems darker than it should be, as if written not with ink but with some other substance, thicker, more vital. For a moment he swears it glistens. He places the letter down quickly, afraid to touch it again. The silence of the manor presses close around him, and though he is alone, he feels the gaze of countless eyes upon him, the heirs who wasted, the children who faltered, the priests who failed. Their despair lingers like smoke saturating the air he breathes. It is not history Jonathan studies. It is a graveyard, and he has chosen to dig where the ground was never meant to be broken. The storm arrived as if summoned, dragging its weight across the moors, thrashing the manor in sheets of rain and winds that shook its fractured bones. Within that cacophony, Jonathan Hale worked by candlelight, tracing the shape of a wall that did not belong. The stones were uneven, freshly sealed once but weakened by rot and time. Behind them, he felt a hollowness, as though the house itself held its breath. Driven by unease and inevitability, he pried at the mortar with iron tools until it gave way in a slow collapse of dust and rubble. Beyond, a darkness exhaled, heavy and damp. Jonathan raised his light. The air that met him was colder than any corridor he had walked before, and laced with the copper tang of iron that needed no explanation. He stepped inside. The wing revealed itself not as forgotten chambers or storage rooms, but as something more profane, a chapel. Yet where one expected devotion, there lingered desecration. The altar stood at the far end, its surface blackened and cracked, the stone discolored, not by time alone but by stains that seemed older than any parish record. Religious symbols hung along the walls, but their forms were inverted, their sanctity reversed. Crucifixes turned downward, saints' faces gouged into anonymity, their hollow sockets smeared with the remnants of wax and ash. Around them were carved symbols Jonathan did not recognize, spirals and intersecting lines, shapes that twisted scripture into a language not meant for man. It was a place not of prayer, but of covenant. Jonathan moved closer, the floor beneath him creaking though it was stone, as though reluctant to bear his weight. The closer he came to the altar, the louder his heart drummed in his ears, until he realized it was not his pulse alone. There was rhythm in the air, a low chant, almost inaudible, carried not by sound but by the marrow of the walls. On a lectern beside the altar lay ledgers bound in cracked leather, pages warped by damp. Jonathan opened them with trembling hands. The script within was Percival Bellrose's unmistakable hand. The first entries were prayers, appeals to God for strength, for dominion, for his name to endure through centuries. But with each page the words shifted. The prayers lost their direction heavenward and bent downward, inward, to something he named the Keeper of Walls. Piety gave way to bargaining, and bargaining gave way to worship of something that was not God. Jonathan read of rites carried out in secrecy, sacrifices made not to the cross, but to the stone, blood spilled upon the altar in the belief that the family's lineage could be bound to the manor, not subject to time nor decline, but eternal, though such eternity had twisted into ruin. Percival's final words scrawled in the ledger made Jonathan's breath hitch. "It is sealed. The house bears our souls as flesh bears bone. We are one. What is given cannot be undone." The realization was heavier than the storm pounding above. The descent of the Bellrose family was no accident of madness, no slow erosion of fortune. It was covenant, a bargain written not in ink, but in blood. Jonathan's knees weakened, and without thought, he steadied himself against the altar. The stone burned cold beneath his palm, and then before his eyes, a shape formed, a handprint, deep red, blooming upon the altar, as though freshly pressed by someone unseen. He staggered back, candle trembling in his grip. The mark was not ancient, it was alive. The chant in the walls grew louder, pressing at his skull. He could not discern the words, but their cadence matched the rhythm of his own racing heart. For the first time, Jonathan felt not merely an intruder in the manor, but a participant. He looked around the chapel again, his mind unraveling threads. If Percival had bound his family to the house, then the generations consumed were not victims of chance. They were tethered, their blood feeding the manor, as roots drink from soil. Their deaths, their madness, their deformities, each was the harvest of a promise made in desperation for dominion. And if the covenant remained unbroken, then the chapel was not ruined but wound. Not abandoned, but active, bleeding still. Jonathan's breath fogged in the cold air. He thought of the villagers who refused to approach, of the priests who fled raving, of the dreams that lured him here with visions of a pale woman in the window. The truth gnawed at him now. His arrival was no accident. The manor had called him as it had called every heir of sorrow before. Perhaps not by blood, but by design. He fled the chapel, stumbling back into the corridor, the storm's howling wind seeping through broken shutters. Yet even as he retreated, he knew what had been revealed could not be undone. He carried the knowledge with him now, the knowledge that the tragedy of the Bellrose family was not history, but curse. And worse still, he felt the eyes of Percival upon him, not the painted gaze of a portrait, but something lingering, patient, waiting. Jonathan closed the passage behind him, sealing the rubble as best he could, but no stone could silence the chant that followed him back through the house, whispering not from without, but from within. That night, as the storm finally broke, Jonathan dreamed again. He saw the altar, the blood, and a hand pressing firmly upon stone. Not his hand, but one that reached through time, pale and strong, commanding him to continue the work begun more than a century ago. And in his dream he heard Percival Sepp's voice, not pleading, not desperate, but triumphant. "You were not called here to write. You were called here to remember." The storm had passed, but its residue lingered in the sodden earth and the greyness of the skies above the moors. Jonathan Hale left Bellrose Manor behind him that morning, its silhouette a jagged wound against the horizon, and made his way to the village. He told himself it was for clarity, for research, for confirmation of the truths he had unearthed within ledgers and hidden chapels. But in truth, he sought reprieve, to know that the weight of what he had seen was not madness of his own making. The villagers regarded him as one might regard a condemned man. Whispers followed him through narrow streets. Eyes darted away, as though meeting his gaze was to risk contagion. Yet among the aged, there lingered a knowledge too heavy to disguise. He was guided to a small cottage at the edge of the village, where an old woman lived who was said to carry memories far older than her years. Her cottage smelled of peat smoke and dried herbs, and her eyes, clouded though they were with age, fixed upon him with unnerving certainty. She did not ask why he had come. Instead, she spoke as though answering a question he had not yet voiced. "Every Bellrose dies beneath its roof," she said softly. "No matter where they run, no matter how far they hide, the house calls them home in the end. Their bones belong to its soil." Jonathan swallowed, his throat dry. "I have read their records. I have seen the proof of their decline. But why? Why must they return?" Her lips curved, not in smile, but in sorrow, because it was promised. Blood once spilled does not rest. Their souls are tethered, like sheep bound to a pen. The house feeds on them. It always has. She leaned closer, her voice lowering, rasping with urgency. "And you, sir, are no longer stranger to it. Do you not feel its eyes on you? Do you not hear it whispering in your sleep? You were not called here by chance. Outsiders who walk too deeply into its marrow are no longer outsiders. They become part of it. Their names are taken, written into its history as surely as if they had been born Bellrose. And once written, there is no erasing." Jonathan's blood chilled. The weight of her words pressed against the truths he had already uncovered, confirming what he had feared, but dared not confess. His dreams of the pale woman, his reflection bending into unfamiliar forms, the chanting that bled from stone, none of it was mere research fatigue. He had stepped into their covenant without knowing, and the house had recognized him. "Then what am I to do?" he asked, his voice breaking with the first hint of despair. The woman shook her head slowly. "Leave if you can, but I do not think the house will let you. It has chosen. And once chosen, a man may flee 1,000 miles, but the roots will find him still. They always do." Her words lingered long after he left her cottage, walking the dirt path back toward the moor. Every step seemed heavier than the last, as though unseen hands pressed against his shoulders, urging him not forward, but downward, into the soil, into the grave of memory itself. By the time the manor came into view again, crouched against the slate sky, Jonathan understood what it was to be prey that returns willingly to its predator. The great doors of Bellrose groaned open at his touch, though he had not thought he pushed them hard. They closed behind him with a weight that felt more like judgment than mere timber. The echo reverberated through the hollow halls, final and absolute. The air inside was different now. Not merely stale, not merely damp with age, but alive. It pressed against him like breath on the back of his neck. Hot and expectant. He could no longer pretend to be an observer. No longer a historian with pen in hand and detachment in mind. He had crossed that threshold when he broke the seal upon the chapel, when he traced the words of Percival's covenant. He was not writing history. He was walking inside it. The house greeted him not with voices, but with silence that was too precise, too sculpted, to be natural. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots seemed staged, as though the manor itself were orchestrating his steps. Every shadow stretched toward him, not away, curling like ink tendrils across the floor. Jonathan tried to retreat to the library, to the safety of candlelight and the illusion of scholarship, but the halls shifted subtly beneath him. Corridors he had walked before bent in new directions. Doors that once opened to familiar rooms now revealed walls or staircases that should not exist. The house was not guiding him now, it was binding him, enclosing him in its architecture of hunger. He remembered the old woman Sep's final words, her voice trembling with the weight of generations. "You have been written into its history now. The house has chosen you." Jonathan sank into a chair, his journal open before him, his pen trembling in his hand. The words he tried to write blurred upon the page, ink pooling as though the paper itself resisted his account. His own handwriting seemed foreign, slanting into shapes he did not intend. It was as though another hand guided his pen, pulling him deeper into a story that no longer belonged to him. And in the silence, beneath the pulse of the storm's aftermath, Jonathan heard it, not the chant of priests, not the wail of heirs, but something quieter, more intimate. It was the sound of the house itself, breathing, waiting. The historian shuddered as realization settled like ice within him. He had come to document the decline of a family, but now he stood as its continuation, not by blood, but by fate. The house had chosen, and the house would not let him go. The storm did not end with the night. It lingered in the walls of the Bellrose Manor, as though thunder itself had taken root in its marrow. Jonathan woke to the sound of shifting timbers, the groan of beams adjusting as if the house was stretching after centuries of slumber. Dust fell from the ceiling in soft trickles, carrying the scent of rot and old smoke. He told himself it was the weather, the decay of age, but when he opened the door to the corridor, it was not the hallway he remembered. The passage bent in directions it had not before, the staircase that once descended to the main hall now curled back upon itself like a serpent eating its tail. Rooms he had charted only days earlier now stood behind unfamiliar doors. The house had rearranged itself, as though correcting a map Jonathan had been foolish to draw. Portraits watched him as he walked. Their faces, once rigid, their eyes glassy with the stillness of oil paint, seemed to swell with expression. Eleanor, in her black veil, appeared to smirk. William, eternally youthful, in his painted innocence, now had cheeks wet with what looked like tears. Lillian, her painted hands clutching lilies, seemed to shift her gaze from the flowers to Jonathan himself, as though pleading for acknowledgement. Jonathan whispered aloud to still his nerves, "It is only imagination, only suggestion." Yet the whispers that rose around him did not agree. They seeped through cracks in the walls, threaded through the staircases, and pooled in the hollow spaces between doors. At first, they were fragments of prayer, scripture half remembered. But soon, the cadence deepened, harmonizing into something older, darker, a chant that throbbed like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Jonathan followed the sound, though he knew he should flee. The historian in him, or perhaps the doomed heir the house wished him to become, could not resist. And as he walked, the manor showed him its truths. The walls bled with visions not of plaster and stone, but of memory. He saw Eleanor, pale and trembling, forced into the earth beneath the chapel floor, her prayers cut short by the silence of soil. He saw William clutching at invisible chains, his cries for mercy answered only by his father's stern command, "Obedience is eternity." He saw Lillian, dragged by unseen hands into the heart of the manor, her voice shredding the air as she begged release from a curse that promised no end. The visions came like lashes, each sharper than the last, and with every strike Jonathan felt his own identity loosen. He stumbled against the walls, clawing at his temples, as though he might tear the images free. But they clung to him, burrowing deep, as though they were not memories he had been shown, but memories he was recovering. And then came Percival. Jonathan saw him not as a withered patriarch bound to dust, but seated upright in the forbidden chapel. His robes, though centuries old, gleamed as though woven yesterday. His hands rested on the altar, fingers splayed over the stone darkened with generations of blood. His lips moved in prayer, but no sound left them. The house itself spoke the words on his behalf. What horrified Jonathan most was not Percival's endurance, nor his unbroken authority, but his eyes. They were not vague or distant, as a spirit's might be. They were clear, focused, alive. And they did not drift through Jonathan as one looks past a shadow. They fixed on him sharp as a blade, narrowing with recognition. Jonathan's knees buckled. He clutched the pews for balance, breath ragged. He wanted to look away, but Percival's gaze was a snare. And in that gaze, Jonathan understood the patriarch had not preserved his soul merely for his bloodline. He had preserved it for all who would ever trespass, all who would ever dare speak his family's name. He was not merely the ancestor of the Bellrose, he was the architect of their prison, the keeper of the covenant, the author of every sorrow written in the house's bones. Jonathan staggered back from the vision, but the house was not done. That night, sleep did not grant him peace. His dreams were banquets, tables stretching endlessly, their surfaces glistening with wine that looked more like blood. At their head sat Percival, but the chairs were not empty. Every Bellrose heir Jonathan had studied sat along the table, Eleanor with her veil, William with his tears, Lillian clutching her lilies, and among them was an empty chair, polished and waiting. When Jonathan's eyes strayed to it, the family raised their cups, voices uniting in a single word that echoed into his marrow. He awoke with the taste of iron on his tongue, as though he had already accepted the cup. His reflection in the cracked mirror by his bedside was no longer his own. His features were thinner, his eyes sunken, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw the faint outline of a black veil over his shoulders. Jonathan pressed his fists against the glass, whispering, "I am not one of you, I am not." But the house gave no answer in denial. Instead, its timbers creaked, slow and deliberate, like the contented sigh of something that had drawn him a little closer into its embrace. The historian was slipping. His notes, once precise records of dates and names, now spilled with words he did not remember writing, prayers half in Latin, half in a tongue that predated scripture. Margins once filled with his tidy observations, now bled with sigils drawn in ink, and once in what he feared was his own blood. Jonathan knew, with a dread that hollowed his chest, that he was no longer chronicling the Bellrose legacy. He was being written into it, and the ink was already staining him from within. The air in the manor had grown heavier with every passing hour, as though the walls themselves leaned closer, pressing Jonathan into submission. His lamps burned low, though their oil was fresh, their flames flickering in patterns that mimicked breath. The corridors whispered, guiding him not aimlessly now, but toward a single purpose. The house no longer waited to be discovered, it demanded resolution. Jonathan returned to the forbidden chapel, the altar slick with its impossible, living stain of blood. He traced his hand along the rear wall where stone seemed uneven, and beneath his palm the outlines of a door yielded, trembling like flesh. He pressed harder, and with a groan that echoed like thunder in a tomb, the wall gave way to reveal a stairwell spiraling downward into darkness. This was the path Lillian had written of, the stairwell that led to the belly of the house, where God had never tread. The air that rose from below was damp, fetid, and alive with the faint sound of a pulse. Jonathan lit his lantern and descended, each step sinking him deeper into the marrow of the manor, deeper into the grave it had prepared. The stairwell gave way to a labyrinth of stone, walls slick with moss, floors littered with fragments of bone. The tunnels twisted upon themselves, echoing his footsteps until he no longer knew if the sound came from behind or before him. And then he saw them, the bones of servants, brides and heirs long forgotten. They were not scattered, as one might expect, in a charnel pit. They were arranged with intent, set into the walls like bricks, femurs interlocked with ribs, skulls mortared with age-old dust, their hollow eyes carved with sigils that glowed faintly in his lantern light. Jonathan's breath caught. He realized he was walking not through a crypt, but through a scripture, each bone a word, each skull a verse, composing a covenant that had been etched not onto parchment, but into flesh. The family's history was not preserved in books, but in the bodies of those it had claimed. Deeper he went, though every instinct screamed to turn back. The tunnels narrowed, then widened, until at last he reached a chamber vast and circular, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center sat a throne of bones, crowned with skulls, its surface worn smooth by centuries of supplication, and upon it rested Percival Bellrose. He was not the frail patriarch Jonathan had read of in ledgers. His shade appeared vast, his robes heavy with the weight of centuries, his hands resting on the armrests like anchors. His face was gaunt yet unbroken, his eyes clear and burning with the fire of one who had bent death into obedience. When he spoke, the voice did not come from his mouth but from the chamber itself, rattling the skulls in their sockets. At last the house has chosen its heir. Jonathan's knees weakened. He clutched the lantern, its flame shivering as though afraid of what it illuminated. "I am no heir," he whispered, though even as he said it, his voice faltered. The family's names haunted his dreams, their faces welcomed him at the long table. Part of him feared the house had already written him into its marrow. Percival Set's eyes narrowed. "You have walked the halls, you have borne witness to our sorrow, our strength. You have drunk from the visions and carried our words upon your lips. There is no refusal, only choice, to join us and endure, or resist and be devoured." The chamber throbbed with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The bones in the walls shifted faintly, as though breathing. From the skulls, whispers coiled into the air, and Jonathan froze as he recognized his own name among them. Again and again it came, Jonathan. Jonathan, Jonathan. The house had already spoken him into its litany. He staggered forward, staring at Percival. "What do you mean by endure?" The patriarch's lips curved into the faintest smile. "To sit where I sit, to be the keeper, to live forever. Not in flesh, but in marrow. The house is eternal because we are eternal. The pact was sealed in blood, and so long as one remains to guard it, our line cannot die. You would not perish. You would become." The lantern trembled in Jonathan's hands. He imagined himself upon that throne, his features stiffening into a mask of eternal vigilance, his voice no longer his own, but the echo of the house itself. He imagined generations yet unborn called into sorrow because of his choice, and he knew with hollow certainty that the temptation was real, to endure, to matter, to belong. But beneath the whispering allure, another truth gnawed. He remembered Eleanor's burial, William's cries, Lillian's terror. They had not chosen this fate, they had been bound to it. And now Percival offered him the same gilded chain. Jonathan Sepp's voice broke as he said, "No, I will not join you." The chamber roared with sudden fury. The lantern guttered. The walls throbbed harder, as if the house itself was a body about to convulse. Percival rose from the throne, impossibly tall, his form flickering between bone and shadow. "Then you will be consumed." The whispers of the dead surged into wails, skulls cracked, their mouths stretching as if to swallow his name whole. The heartbeat of the house pounded faster, rattling Jonathan's bones from within. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest as if it would burst. And then, clarity. He remembered the old woman Sip's words, "To sever the covenant is to break the chain, but chains do not fall apart. They must be shattered." Jonathan understood. To escape, he could not merely resist, he had to end it. The covenant was written not in parchment, but in house, in blood, in history. To sever it would mean fire. To sever it would mean destruction. To sever it might erase the family, the house, and himself with it. His lantern sep's flame flickered, throwing shadows like flailing limbs upon the chamber walls. Jonathan tightened his grip on the handle, and through the roar of the dead, he whispered, "If you demand fire, then fire you shall have." The shade of Percival loomed closer, eyes like two suns burning in the dark, and the bones of the chamber leaned in, waiting for Jonathan's final choice. Jonathan rose from the catacombs as though climbing out of a grave, his lantern sputtering, his body trembling under the weight of 100 voices that were not his own. The house quaked around him, its beams groaning, its portraits sneering as he stumbled back through the chapel doors. It was no longer a place of stone and timber, but a body writhing with hunger, desperate to bind him into its marrow. He fell against the altar, his breath ragged, his palms pressed to the cold stone where Percival had made his covenant. The blood that stained its surface seemed to glisten, eager to draw him in. But Jonathan had seen enough. He understood now the house was not merely cursed, it was alive, a scripture written in ash and bone bound together by sacrifice, and every story had an ending. His hands shook as he reached into his satchel. Inside was the oil he had carried for his lanterns, the only weapon he had left. He doused the altar with it, then splashed it across the pews, across the walls etched with symbols. The scent of it filled the air, sharp and suffocating. The chapel seemed to shudder, as though it understood his intent. The whispers rose to screams. Skulls rattled in the catacombs below, voices shrieking in panic and rage. Jonathan struck flint against steel. The spark caught. A small flame licked at the oil, hesitated, then roared to life with a ferocity that startled even him. The chapel became a furnace. Fire crawled up the walls, devoured the altar, and leapt onto the pews. The inverted crosses fell from their nails, swallowed in flame. The house screamed. The sound was not wood breaking, nor glass shattering, but the shriek of something ancient being torn apart. Jonathan staggered from the chapel into the manor's grand halls. Flames raced ahead of him, devouring portraits, curling paper into ash, cracking the very bones of the house. He watched the paintings of the Bellrose family writhe as if alive, their painted eyes melting into black tears. Eleanor, William, Lillian, their faces distorted and vanished in smoke, while Percival's gaze lingered longest, his image burning last, as though refusing to surrender. The ceiling beams crashed down behind him. The corridors twisted and warped, not by supernatural design but by collapse. Jonathan ran, the floor splintering beneath his boots, the fire pursuing him like a tide. He carried only what he could. The historian's journal he had filled with notes, and without knowing why, a broken fragment of mirror he had taken from a bedroom days earlier. Outside, the moors spread before him in twilight, grey and vast. He burst through the manor doors as they buckled inward, the flames consuming their hinges. Behind him, Bellrose Manor rose like a pyre. Its windows blazed, its towers crumbled, its voice howled into the dawn. Smoke spiraled upward in black columns, as though the house sought to etch its memory upon the sky. Jonathan collapsed onto the wet grass, coughing, his chest heaving. He stared at the inferno, and for a moment he felt something strange, not triumph, not relief, but hollowness. He had torn down a monument of centuries, reduced it to cinders. Yet even as it fell, he could not shake the sensation that the house had wanted this ending, that the flames were not destruction, but release. The villagers came at a distance, standing on the ridge, staring in silence at the blaze. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. None approached Jonathan. Perhaps they feared he was no longer entirely a man, but a remnant of the house that had fed upon their lineage for generations. The roof collapsed inward with a final roar, sparks spiraling into the morning sky. The screams of the trapped souls faded, or perhaps blended into the wind, impossible to distinguish. Jonathan shut his eyes, but their echoes remained. At last he rose, his legs trembling. In his hand, the shard of mirror caught the light of dawn. He lifted it, intending to see his soot-stained face, to assure himself that he remained whole. But the reflection that stared back was not his own. The glass showed Percival Bellrose, eyes cold and eternal, gazing with quiet triumph. Jonathan gasped, dropping the shard, but the image clung to his mind, burned there like a brand. The truth struck him with the force of fire. He had not destroyed the covenant, he had only inherited it. The moors were silent save for the crackling ruin behind him. The estate had fallen, yet something endured. Jonathan felt it in the marrow of his bones, in the pulse beneath his skin. The house was gone, but its echo lived within him. He turned toward the horizon, smoke trailing behind like a shroud. Whether he was free or forever bound, he did not know. The curse was never ended, only passed on. And as he walked into the grey dawn, the name Bellrose whispered with every step.